Everything isn't always as it appears to be. Let me say that again. Everything isn't always the way it appears to be. And of course, I'm going to give you an example from my life. My husband and I going to Shipshewana, that's what I seem to always talk about. We love that place. It's just our favorite go-to place. It's so peaceful, so restful. If you haven't been there, it's in Indiana. Take a time to go. Well, in Shipshewana, there is a building called the Mennohoff. And the Mennohoff is actually an Amish and Mennonite historical museum. And let me tell you, anything you want to know about the history of the Amish or anything you want to know about their lifestyle, you'll find it there in the Mennohoff. Now, this is interesting because in the Mennohoff, there is a room. And on the door to that room, it's called Tornado Room. And one day, Bill and I thought, okay, we've waited long enough. We're going to go check this out. So we walk up to the door of the room, and as the door opens, we walked into another century. Suddenly, we were no longer in the Mennohoff. We were in an old, old barn. The walls were like that weathered board, and there was boards on the floor, and it was covered with straw. And in the center was an overturned barrel, and on it was the only light in the room, which was a lantern. And so we're just sort of standing there, looking around there. They had implements in there that were from a bygone era that you would find in an old barn. There were horse collars, there were reins, scythes, that you cut the wheat with. There were pitchforks and shovels and hoes and rakes and all those things that you might find in an old, old barn centuries ago. Well, we were just standing there kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. I mean, we're in this room, what's going to happen? When suddenly the floor starts to tremble. And it starts to tremble pretty good. So you know how you kind of back up and you put your hand against the wall for kind of support, like, okay, what's going to happen? But then the walls started shaking. So we've got the floor that's trembling, and we got the walls that are shaking, and then we hear this roar. And it's coming in a distance, and it's coming at a very, very rapid rate, and it sounds deafening. So the walls by this time are shaking so much, and the floor is shaking, there's nothing to hold on to. And let me tell you, I was getting a little apprehensive. I really was. So we stood there, and suddenly it was shaking so much that the lantern fell off, so now we were in darkness. And the roar started getting louder, and it sounded like a very large freight train coming right at us. And let me tell you, the walls are shaking, you're in the dark, the floor is vibrating, this roar is coming, and pretty soon it's right overhead. This tornadic wind, that's what it sounded like. It was just right overhead, and it felt like the building was just going to go. And we were standing there, nothing to hold on to. I think we were holding on to each other, and it just kept going on until finally, we could tell that it was lessening, and the storm was moving away and going off in the distance, and then everything settled down. We felt like we had been in an old barn in the middle of a field, in the middle, direct hit of a tornado, and survived. Well, the door opened, and we walked out into the Mennohoff, into the normal historical museum. And we kind of looked back and thought, everything is not as it appears to be. We really felt like we had just been through a tornado, but that wasn't the case. It only appeared to be so. So today I have 3 examples from Scripture of people who have gone through something that they didn't understand, and they could only see part of the picture, and it wasn't really what it seemed to be. So the first account is a man from Uz. His name is Job. And Job is described by God. Now this is amazing. God is describing Job as a blameless man above reproach, a very honest and blameless man, one who fears God and runs from evil. What a high compliment to be called blameless. Job was extremely well known. He was a very, very wealthy man. He had 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. That's 1,000 oxen. 500 donkeys. He had 7,000 sheep, and he had 5,000 camels. I asked myself, well, what do you do with 5,000 camels? Really? And he had servants that took care of all of those herds. His property, his land was so vast that you couldn't tell. They weren't all mixed together. They were all over the place. And he had servants to take care of them. But Job also had children. He had 10 children. He had 7 sons, and he had 3 daughters. Job was a very blessed man. Well, one day, Job was going about his normal business. It was a normal day, when suddenly he saw a fast approaching messenger. And this messenger came running up, out of breath. Job, the Sabaeans came, and they took all your oxen, they took all your donkeys, and they killed all your servants. And Job is just standing there, like shock, when suddenly another messenger came running up to him. And he was running fast, and he said, Job, fire from heaven fell. And I'm assuming that's lightning. Fire from heaven fell, and it totally destroyed all of your 7,000 sheep and all of your servants. I managed to get away to come and tell you. I'm the only one left. And Job is still taking this in. It's like a shock to him. I can't even imagine what that kind of news would be to somebody. When another messenger approached, and he said, Job, the Chaldeans came and they took all 5,000 of your camels and they killed all your servants. Job just stood there. Everything was suddenly gone. He didn't see any storm. He didn't see any Sabaeans, any Chaldeans. His property was so vast, he didn't even know what was happening when another messenger came. And he said, Job, there was a giant wind that destroyed the home where all your children were, and they're all dead. At that, Job just took his garments and he just tore them. And he got down on his knees and he said, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He worshiped God. Job didn't know what was happening to him. He had no idea, and he was not privy to a scene that had been taking place in heaven. In heaven, a short time before, when some of the angels of God presented themselves before God, and along with them came Satan. Now, let me say this. God is omniscient. God knows everything. He knows Satan. He knows the way his mind thinks. He knows what he wants to do and what his goal is. And he asked some questions, but he already knew the answer to them, but he asked them anyway. And he looked at Satan and he said, where have you been? And Satan said, oh, I've been roaming the earth, going to and fro. And God said, have you seen my servant Job? Have you noticed him? Oh, he knew that was in Satan's sights. Satan hated anyone who worshiped God. And Satan said, oh, I've seen your servant. You got a hedge around him. You pay him to worship you. You gave him everything he ever needed and more. You made him extremely wealthy. And the only reason that he is worshiping you is because you have given him so much and you are protecting him. He says, but if you take away what he has, he'll curse you to your face. And God looked at Satan and said, go ahead, but don't touch him. Thus, Job found himself without anything. And Satan, do you remember those old movies where the villain dressed in black is, rubbing his hands together, watching to see what was going to happen, what evil was going to take place? Well, I could picture him just waiting to see what Job was going to do. He wanted him to curse God. He wanted everybody to curse God. He didn't want anybody to worship God. So what happened? Foiled again. There was Job on his knees worshiping God. He didn't curse God. He worshiped him. So another scene was in heaven. Another scene that Job wasn't privy to. And again, the angels of God came before him, and along with him, Satan. And again, our omniscient God asked Satan, where have you been? And he said, I've been roaming the earth, going to and fro. And again, God asked him a question that he already knew. He knew this blasphemy. He knew this accuser. He knew the way his mind worked. And he says, have you noticed my servant Job? And Satan said, all right, I'll give you this. It's just possible that a man could lose everything and still worship you. But if you touch him, if you touch his skin for skin, he'll curse you to your face. And God said, go ahead, but don't take his life. Suddenly, Job, who was still in mourning and still in shock, was covered from the top of his head to the soles of his feet with weeping, running sores. He had so many sores that his face was totally unrecognizable. And he was in such pain, and he was in such agony. He was a mess. He itched, and it was painful. So he went out away from his house, and he went to a garbage dump. And he found himself a pile of garbage, and he sat on it and found a piece of pottery, and he started scraping his skin, hoping to just find some relief from this itching pain. And his wife came up to him. He still had a wife. And she said, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? And Job looked up at her and said, woman, you don't know what you're talking about. Do we accept the good from God and not the bad? I know that my Redeemer lives, and one day I'm going to stand in front of him. The devil was foiled again. Job didn't curse God. Job worshiped God again. But it didn't end. This didn't end for Job. No, in the preceding chapters, you find out that he was visited by 5 or more friends that just came to tell him how sinful he was. And if you would just repent, Job, God would take this off of you. And Job kept saying, I didn't do anything. How can I repent for something I didn't do? And they said, no, you did something. And this went on and on and on until finally, the last 2 chapters of Job is absolutely amazing because God comes on the scene in a whirlwind and he talks to Job. And he said, Job, what I do is beyond your understanding. And he proceeds. If you have a chance to read those 2 chapters, read them, because God tells Job what he does and what he has done. Did you know that I do this? Did you know that I do that? And he goes on and on and on. And Job finally says, my ears have heard of God, but now I know him. I've seen him. And God restored everything to Job. He gave him twice as much property as he ever had. He gave him 10 more children, same wife. I don't know. And a very long and satisfying life. Job had no idea. He does now. He had no idea. It has seemed to him that he was being punished for something he didn't do. It seemed to him that he was being treated very badly, and he couldn't convince anybody that he was innocent. What he didn't know at that time was that God knew Job. He knew Job's steadfastness. He knew his blamelessness. And he let him be an example to the enemy, that Satan would see that men will worship him if they have nothing. Things aren't always the way they seem to be. The next example is a Levite. His name is Elkanah. And Elkanah had 2 wives. One's name was Peninnah, if I'm pronouncing it right. And she gave him many sons and daughters. She gave him many children. And the other one was called Hannah. And remember this, the Lord had closed her womb. Well, Peninnah made life miserable for Hannah. I like all these AHs at the end of the names. And she just constantly told her what a disgrace Hannah was because she didn't have children. She was barren. And I think this is what happened also. Bible doesn't say it, so this is my opinion. But Elkanah made Hannah know that she was loved the most. He told her that, aren't I worth, a dozen children? And he loved her. And our other wife would know this. I mean, she would get wind of the fact that she wasn't loved the most. And so that would make her a little bit more vicious. So poor Hannah had to take a lot from Peninnah. She was just constantly ridiculed. Well, being a Levite, the time came to go into the tabernacle to offer sacrifices. So he would go and he took Peninnah and all her children, and he took Hannah. And after the sacrifices, he brought the portion of meat to Peninnah and to all of the children, but he got a double portion to give to Hannah. But by this time, after being under Peninnah's mouth, she just was too upset to eat. She just could weep, and she wept, and she wept. And she got before the Lord, and she cried out to him, God, I want a son. I want a son so badly. I want a son. And over and over and over, and she pleaded with the Lord, tears running down her face. She was beside herself. She was so upset that nothing was coming out of her mouth. She was just moving her lips. She was in such a state. And finally, she calls out to God in desperation, God, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you to serve you all the days of his life. Well, Eli the priest was there, and he saw this woman, and the way she looked to him, she looked like she was intoxicated. So he went up to her and he said, woman, I'm ashamed of you being in that condition in the tabernacle. And she said, no, you don't understand. And she proceeded to tell Eli just what was happening in her life and how she was pleading God for a child. And Eli said, woman, go home, eat something. Surely God has heard you, and he will grant your wish. Now this comforted Hannah so much that she was able to eat. She went home, and a time later, she became pregnant. And at the age of 3 years old, when that child was weaned, she brought that child to the tabernacle. And she gave him to the service of the priest in the tabernacle to raise him to serve the Lord all of his life. Now, Hannah, all she could see in her life was the fact that she was barren. All she could see was the fact that she didn't have any children. And she couldn't understand why. But see, God had a plan. Things aren't always the way they seem to be. Long before she even considered having a child, God had a special child planned for that woman. But if Hannah had had many children, would she have given one to the Lord? So God closed her womb, and she was desperate enough to say, I will give this son to you. And that child that she gave to the Lord was Samuel. Samuel was the last of the great judges in Israel, but he was a great prophet. He was a man of God. He anointed David king of Israel. He was a very, very, very godly man who served the Lord all of his life. Things aren't always the way they seem to be. Hannah was only concerned with the fact that she couldn't have a child. She could see nothing beyond that point, but God had a plan for her. Things aren't always the way they seem to be. God is working behind the scenes in our lives, and we don't know it. All we do is see what we see. We don't see his hand upon everything in our life. The last example is a minor prophet. Now, there are major prophets and minor prophets, and the only difference is the length of their book. They're all equally important. And this prophet's name was Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk was a prophet to the southern kingdom, which was Judah. And he was a very frustrated prophet. He had been preaching God's words to Judah for years, and nothing was happening. In fact, Jeremiah before him gave out God's warning of judgment that was going to come on the people of Judah for over 40 years. So for 100 years, God was warning Judah that if you don't turn, I am going to send judgment on you. So Habakkuk, all he could see was that the people of Judah were totally turned away from God. They would not worship God. The temple, the tabernacle was a disgrace. The courts were a disgrace. They were a vicious people who only wanted to do what the heathen nations did and worship anybody but the living God. They totally refused to listen to the prophets. And Habakkuk was so upset. He finally got to the point where he called out to God himself. He said, God, do you see what's going on? Do you plan on doing anything to these people? They're not listening. They are so against you, they won't listen to the prophets. What are you going to do? He was pretty bold, but he was very frustrated. So he waited for God to talk to him, and God did. And he said, Habakkuk, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something that you would never expect me to do. Something that you will be totally surprised at. And of course, that caught Habakkuk's attention. He said, God, what are you going to do? And God said, well, I'm going to bring an evil heathen nation against my people. I'm going to have them take those people into captivity, and they're going to be in captivity for a long time. And Habakkuk said, you can't do that. And God was referring to the Babylonians. And Habakkuk said, you can't do that, God. You're holy. You can't use evil against your people. You just can't do that. And he's arguing with God. And God said, Habakkuk, I'm going to do this. And they're going to be in captivity a long time. But Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. Habakkuk just stopped. And he found out what God meant. God said, I'm not going to leave my people. I'm not going to forsake them. Yes, they're going to go into captivity for a very long time. But I will deal with those Babylonians. In my time, I will bring another nation to defeat them. And I will rise up a king that will listen to me and let my people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple and have freedom once again in their homeland. But Habakkuk didn't see anything happening. He knew that God said to trust him, but nothing changed. Nothing. Everything was the same rebellious, stiff-necked people, the same horrible court system, the same tabernacle in disarray and idol worshipers. He didn't say anything, but something had changed in Habakkuk. And Habakkuk said to the Lord, and let me paraphrase this. It's one of my favorite portions of Scripture. He said, I don't see anything happening, Lord. Your people are as bad as they ever were. I don't see anything changing at all. Nothing. There's no cattle in the stalls. There's no grapes on the vines. The fields have nothing growing in them. But yet I'll trust you. Yet I'll trust you. Something had changed in Habakkuk. Now remember those puzzle pieces I gave you? If you hold them up. Can anybody tell me, by looking at their puzzle piece, what the picture is that piece belongs to? Can't do it, can you? This puzzle piece represents everything that you need to know about your life right now. That's what it represents. It represents all of God's wisdom that He's given you, direction, sustaining, working in your life. He's any kind of knowledge that He wants you to have about any situation that you're dealing with. That's as much He's given you. One little piece. God knows the whole picture. But He only is giving you this much. You want more. You want to know what's going to happen. When are my children coming to the Lord? When is my family going to get saved? When am I going to get a job? When am I going to have a child? By the way, Hannah had 6 children after she gave birth to Samuel. God had that plan too. But what you ask of God, you want to know more. And God says, this is what I've given you. That's it. That's all you need. If you needed more, I would give you more. Habakkuk didn't see anything happening after God said to trust him. Nothing changed. And yet he said, I trust you, God. God is saying to you today, because he knows you. You know, he knows you better than you know yourself. He knows you more intimately than you know yourself. He knew Job so well, he knew what Job was going to do. He knew he would stand and he would defy Satan. But this is what God has for you today. He says, if you can lift up this piece of a puzzle to me, and you can say, God, if this is all that you have given me to know about my circumstances, I'm going to trust you. He says, if you can come up front, and I'd like you to, and bring that piece of the puzzle with you, because there's something about moving and responding to a message that you can honestly say, on Mother's Day in 2018, I went to the front with a piece of a puzzle, and I looked to God, and I said, God, I don't understand it. I don't know. I want more information in my life. I want to know what's going on. I want to know when my children are going to get saved, or when I'm going to get a job, or when I'm not going to feel so lonely, or when I'm not going to be sick, when my finances will improve, when I'll get the education I want, when my ministry will straighten out. I want to know more, God. But this is all you've given me, and now I'm going to hold it up to you and say, God, it's enough. I trust you. Now, this morning we said, I'll say yes to the Spirit of God moving. And he's moving right now. And if you come forward, God is going to meet you here, and we're going to pray. So I'm asking you to come forward.